I'm Vinnie Politan. The subject of my investigation is the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe and the dramatic retrial of his girlfriend Karen Reed. It's a case with no eyewitnesses to the alleged crime, which is why expert testimony is so important. Here's the story. Karen Reed stands trial again for the tragic January 29, 2022 death of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, who was found dead in the snow outside of a home in Canton, Massachusetts. Prosecutors allege Karen Reed struck John O'Keefe with her Lexus during a blizzard, leaving him to die from blunt force head injuries and hypothermia. At the retrial, accident reconstruction experts from both sides take center stage. Dr. Judson Welcher, a biomechanical engineer for the prosecution, used live paint transfer tests and backing trials with a replica SUV to assert that torn fabric and tailgate fragments align with Karen Reed's Lexus backing into John O'Keefe. In stark contrast, Daniel Wolf from ARCA for the defense conducted crash dummy experiments under simulated conditions. Wolf concluded that none of his results replicated the damage on John O'Keefe's clothing or on Karen Reed's SUV. These competing expert narratives now shape the heart of the trial, with jurors weighing forensic science against reconstruction models and witness accounts. I'll be honest with you, throughout my career at Court TV and in all these criminal trials I've covered, a lot of times I've looked at experts and I've said, yeah, whatever, you know? One side has their expert paid for, the other side has their expert paid for, and you just gotta look beyond all of it, right? This case might be different. It might be extremely different because you have experts and doing experiments as well. They're not just giving opinions, they're showing the jury something, which to me gives the jury more of an opportunity to perhaps latch on to what one or more of these experts is saying and could be all the difference in the case. That's what we're gonna focus on this program this hour. So let's begin with what everyone's been calling the blue paint experiment. This is the prosecution's expert. An expert didn't testify in the first case, was not a part of the first trial. In the second trial, the prosecution trying to up their game, trying to convince this jury about what happened to John O'Keefe the night he died. So this is Judson Welcher. He's a doctor, he's a PhD, accident reconstructionist working for Aperture. Let's take a look at this blue paint experiment.
Let's have the car drive into me. I did this at very low speeds, and you'll see, and we'll throw this from two different angles. That's me showing I'm doing test 2. This is from a camera that we have pointing down at it. This is the speed. You'll see it's only about a 2-mile-an-hour impact, but even a 2-mile-an-hour impact redirects me back and causes me to rotate and take a step. So similar to the other test, this is the post-contact image of the transfers onto my arm. Actually, the yellow paint, you can see from my hand is here. This is from the arm and forearm.
Do you have an opinion whether, based on the data and based on the physical damage and your testing, whether that is consistent with a collision or a impact with Mr. John O'Keefe?
It is consistent with the collision as long as it's greater than approximately 8 miles an hour.
Based on all the evidence you considered, could you share with the jury what your opinion is to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty about whether the defendant's Lexus struck Mr. O'Keefe on January 29, 2022, around 12:32 a.m.?
Objection, Your Honor.
Going to an
I can answer? Yes, based on the totality of the evidence, DNA, everything I've talked about, that is consistent with that happening. With a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that is what happened.
Objection, move to strike.
It's the testimony, it's the experiments, it's the video, it's everything. And all of that brings us to the first question in our investigation. And it's about this experiment. What did the blue paint experiment prove? It's a powerful image, no doubt. What did it prove to this jury? Let's bring in our guests here to help answer that question. Massachusetts criminal defense attorney Joseph Krowski Jr. and Annie Elise, host of the extremely popular Seriously podcast and true crime YouTube channel 10 to Life. Great to have you both here. All right, Joseph, I'll begin with you. I usually do ladies first, but I'm just going to start with the criminal defense attorney tonight. Hope you're not offended, Annie. Joseph,
It's all good.
What did this blue paint experiment prove to this jury?
Well, it proved a lot, right? It was just one piece of the puzzle for Dr. Welcher. And again, some people found Dr. Welcher to be a little gruff and a little acerbic. He is a biomechanical engineer with a PhD from USC. He is the quintessential engineer. Compare him to Dr. Wolf, who failed his proficiency testing on the first go-around, the same test that Trooper Paul passed. So let's go back to what it was. It wasn't an accident reconstruction. It was just one piece of his analysis, and it was a matter of simple geometry. And what it did, it showed the jury that the dimensions of John O'Keefe line up when you're talking about height, weight, and positioning. The injuries to the arm, the linear abrasions line up with the tail light. The knee is not struck. There is a spoiler on that car that lines up almost exactly to where the gash was, or excuse me, the injury was on the right side of the forehead of John O'Keefe. So he combined that with the debris field and the broken tail light and all of the other evidence, but it was certainly an important part. Some people criticized him for not going further, but as an engineer, he took the conservative approach. And what he testified to was there was too many unknowns and variables for him to actually use a crash test dummy and try to duplicate it at speeds ranging from 24 to 29 miles per hour. I don't think in his wildest imagination he ever believed that the defense was going to gift the prosecution with doing just that.
It's interesting, Joe, you mentioned that he's a little bit gruff, but very accomplished. Some would say Joseph Krowski a little gruff, but extremely accomplished as a criminal defense attorney as well. Let me ask you, Annie, from your perspective, I want to put this picture up because it's a side-by-side of what Joe just described to us, which is the blue paint next to the injuries on John O'Keefe's arm. From your perspective, what did this blue paint experiment prove?
I think to your point, it provided a very visual, tangible demonstration for the jury, reinforcing the theory of a contact injury. And I think that's what was so important here. They needed to see that. I also think it showed that the arm could align with the tail light, that the upper spoiler of the car could align with the injury, and that the bumper could possibly align with the knee injury as well. So I think it was really impactful to see. However, that being said, I also think he didn't necessarily take the next steps to discuss the kinds of force that's required here. It was also done at 2 miles per hour, not the speed that the Commonwealth is alleging, although I'm not suggesting that they do it at the full speed, but I think that there were some gray draws to it because it's an illustration, but also some things that are still questionable.
Let's take a listen to Dr. Scorti-Bello here talking about the injuries, but also talking about the concept of this side swipe that the prosecution is really talking about here.
To a reasonable degree of medical certainty, did you reach a conclusion about the cause of Mr. O'Keefe's death?
Yes. The cause of death was determined to be blunt impact injuries of head and hypothermia, and the manner was undetermined.
A bruise on the knee, is that consistent with a sideswipe impact?
Could be.
Okay. Joseph, Dr. Scorti-Bello, again, is coming back and saying the manner is undetermined. We've discussed that in the past. You said that's okay, that's normal. Could be a side swipe. Are you at all concerned with the blue paint experiment that it's very, like he's standing with his arm in a certain place. He leans in a little bit at a certain place, that it's sort of staged, or is that okay?
That's okay, because he made it clear that he wasn't trying to duplicate what actually happened. He, as an engineer, has to take a measured, conservative approach. He was offering an opinion to a degree of engineering certainty, and he made it clear in his testimony, both on direct and cross-examination, that with the unknowns and variables, he was not comfortable because they didn't know exactly where John O'Keefe was standing. They didn't know exactly at what point of the key cycle that John O'Keefe was struck. So he knew he couldn't duplicate it exactly as it happened on Fairview that night on January 29th. So again, this was just a small part of forming his overall opinion. And what was important and impactful about this, according to him, was that the geometry worked.
Let me ask you, Annie, are there a lot of questions still unanswered here? And I say that because what Joseph just said can be interpreted two ways. One, like you can't figure this stuff out, you don't know. But if you don't know, does that become part of the potential doubt for the jury?
I absolutely think so, because of course nobody knows exactly how John was standing, what his arm position was. So they're going to do a demonstration that fits what they believe the theory to be. So I think there still is a lot of doubt around this, because quite frankly, anybody who saw that image of the lacerations on John's arm could paint a taillight and walk into the taillight and move their arm perfectly to then show that it's duplicated on them as well. Now, I understand there's the science behind it, and he had cited some specific data points, but at the same time, too, it's not entirely compelling, at least in my opinion, because we still don't know where John was standing or how he was standing. It's just moving your arm into the taillight.
No eyewitnesses to the alleged crime. Okay, you're going to eat into your time in the next segment, but go ahead.
That's 99% of hit-and-run accidents. They're not captured on film, and the experts come in and they work with what they have. We're ignoring the pieces, the shards of taillight in his clothing. We're ignoring the debris field. A point now not contested by the defense is that that vehicle actually backed up at least 24 miles per hour for at least 60 feet in the exact same area where his body was left. So we can't look at just this one little exercise in geometry.
When we come back, our experts stay with us. What did the 29-mile-per-hour experiment prove? Karen Reed is in the midst of the retrial of the century.
She is factually innocent. She's guilty.
There's something wrong in this county.
Come at me.
John O'Keefe was killed by that defendant, Karen Reed.
She's the victim of a corrupted investigation that was never about the truth.
Another big day here at the Dedham Courthouse.
Fight on. Nothing's breaking me, Matt.
You'll see it all unfold right here on Court TV.
The Karen Reed murder retrial. Live coverage weekday mornings, 8/7 Central on Court TV.
All that smoke and all those mirrors will not ever reach their burden. Not when every piece of this case was handled by a disgraced investigator with a motive to protect his friends, not when the physical evidence contradicts their very theory, not when their own medical examiner won't call this case a homicide. By the end of this trial, you'll conclude that Karen Reed is not guilty of hitting John O'Keefe with her SUV. There was no collision. She's the victim of a botched and biased and corrupted investigation that was never about the truth, folks. It was about preserving loyalty. You'll find that this case is the very definition of reasonable doubt.
And this is really a big part of the defense case, trying to establish to this jury that there's no evidence of an actual collision between Karen Reed's SUV and John O'Keefe. Now, without witnesses, right, you're left to bringing in these experts. So obviously the defense is going to bring in their own experts to try to demonstrate this to the jury. And the experts they brought in, incredible video evidence that they have brought in showing the experiments that they did. One of them with the SUV, a Lexus, a replica SUV, backing up at 29 miles per hour. 29, a little faster than the allegations of 24. So let's take a look and listen to the testimony as we watch the 29-mile-per-hour experiment done by the defense expert.
So this is another feed that we had of video. This was triggered, so we do have data from this perspective. So what you'll see is my colleague will move away from the assembly with the dry ice, and then the vehicle will accelerate in reverse.
What are we looking at here?
So this is the intended impact configuration with the Rescue Randy suspended here by the forklift, and again, kind of in the path of the profile at that right rear corner.
How much does this test dummy weigh?
Approximately 200 pounds.
What is the 29-mile-an-hour impact test in test F?
So this was a test that we conducted with a what's known as a Rescue Randy, or a test dummy, that was a full-on impact to the right rear corner of the Lexus.
What did you observe with regard to the damage, if any, to the internal components of the quarter panel taillight? And I'm talking about the chrome pieces and the diffusers.
It was less in all of the tested taillights than that of the subject taillight.
And what are we seeing in these series of photos?
So this is obviously during the collision sequence. The body now has loaded into the lift gate and the back window. What you're seeing here is the back window shattering. And this is just a few split second later in time where, again, the body is continuing to move with the vehicle as it's contacted.
And that SUV got trashed in that experiment. But let's get to the next question in our investigation about this experiment done by the defense. What did the 29-mile-per-hour experiment prove? Right? You do these experiments, you show them to the jury, you're trying to prove something. Still with us to help with our investigation, Joseph Krowski Jr. and Annie Elise. Annie, from your perspective, what did this 29-mile-per-hour experiment prove?
I think it proved that the injuries in the experiment weren't necessarily completely consistent with the injuries we saw on John O'Keefe. In the experiment, we see road rash on the face, the torso, the arms, something that we didn't see with John. We saw those lacerations, but not road rash. We also see that shattered rear window and damage that was caused to the lift gate, to the bumper, to the exterior, something that we didn't see with Karen's car. We saw the shattered taillight, and I think almost arguably most importantly was that diffuser. It was still not as damaged as Karen's was. And I guess one more thing too is the dummy's shoes remained on, whereas we know that wasn't the case with John O'Keefe. So I think it was a really great and powerful illustration. But that being said, there of course is some debate out there about, did they use the most appropriately weighted dummy? Did they go at the right speed? I found it more compelling than Welcher's, but that's going to be up to a jury to decide.
Okay, Joseph, what are your thoughts here about the 29-mile-per-hour experiment? What did it prove?
So just one quick point. It's interesting you opened up this segment with the opening of Alan Jackson. The significant part of the opening, of course, was the House Long to Die at 227. We should devote a segment to the fact that Richard Green is not going to testify. There was also a part of the opening where the defense owned the burden that they were going to unequivocally be able to establish by eyewitnesses that John O'Keefe went in the house. That's been abandoned. He's now gone from the basement to the garage. But let's talk about the 29 miles per hour. I know you don't want me to talk about the 24 miles per hour. The 29 miles per hour was an accident reconstruction that involved a center of mass impact. The Commonwealth is not alleging a center of mass impact. That's why you have the body going straight backwards rather than the spinning pirouette, and that's why you have more damage to the vehicle. What does it show for the Commonwealth? Well, for 2 years, people have talked about the fact that that Lexus couldn't obtain a speed of 24 miles per hour in that short of distance. Here, the defense put in testimony or evidence that it could get to 29 miles per hour without any difficulty. They're no longer challenging key cycle 1162, the fact that that car backed up at that approximate speed at 34 Fairview. For 2 years, we heard that the taillight, because it was polycarbonate, couldn't be broken by an arm. That now seems to be a conceded point. So it's a little bit confusing and misleading because it shows a center of mass impact on Randy. but certainly it's really not relevant because it's not what's alleged. One question that's not being asked is, does anyone know where Randy was on January 29th? Because by tomorrow, he's probably going to be the new third-party culprit of the defense team.
There's a little bit of the Joseph Krosky sarcasm making its way into the program. Appreciate it. Let me ask you, Annie, after watching these experiments, do you feel like you know more or less about what happened to John O'Keefe?
Less, if I'm being honest. I feel like it just confused me more, even though I feel as though I know a lot. But because neither side used the exact speed, weight, all of these things, it's difficult and it can be inferred either way, I think. But for me, a lot of reasonable doubt, certainly.
All right, Joseph, because you ate up some of your time in the prior segment, I need like the 30-second version answer here. As all these experiments have come through, are you surprised? Is this unusual for the jury to actually see all of these?
I am very surprised. Look, again, excellent defense attorneys, and I don't like criticizing fellow attorneys, but you have me on to call balls and strikes as I see them. I'm still befuddled that the defense chose to put this evidence and this testimony before the jury, especially the 24-mile-per-hour reconstruction.
All right. Big thank you, Joseph Krosky Jr. Always great to have you on. Annie Elise, first time. Hope you come back a lot. Serialously podcast. Everybody knows it already. And of course, go to the True Crime YouTube channel, 10 to Life. Thank you so much. Up next, what did the 24-mile-per-hour experiment prove? I'm Vinnie Politan. We continue our investigation of the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe, a man who was raising his sister's orphaned children when he was found dead on a fellow police officer's front yard. His girlfriend Karen Reed has been charged with his murder, although no one has witnessed the alleged crime. Here's the story. The retrial of Karen Reed, accused of killing her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, hinges on forensic science and sharply conflicting expert testimony. Prosecutors allege that in the early morning hours of January 29th, 2022, Karen Reed, intoxicated and angry, backed her SUV into John O'Keefe, leaving him to die in the snow. Central to their case is accident reconstruction expert Dr. Judson Welcher, who conducted live testing with a replica Lexus. He claims fabric tears, taillight shards, and vehicle damage align with a fatal impact caused by Reed's SUV. The defense counters with Daniel Wolf from ARCA, who performed controlled crash dummy experiments. He argues that none of their tests replicated the SUV damage described by the prosecution. These dueling reconstructions are pivotal. With no eyewitnesses, jurors must decide which scientific narrative best fits the evidence and ultimately whether Karen Reed is guilty of murder or the victim of a flawed investigation. The experts in this case have been next level when you talk about what they're presenting to this jury, with the videos and the explanations and their backgrounds and their experience and their expertise. It's fascinating to watch a true battle of the experts in the Karen Reed trial. So let's take a look at another experiment done by the defense, right? The defense is bringing on their experts to try to rebut what the prosecution is trying to prove, which is a collision between Karen Reed's SUV and John O'Keefe, a collision which resulted in John O'Keefe falling and ended up dying in the cold. So here is an experiment that was done at the number that is probably the most relevant here, the 24-mile-per-hour experiment, where the defense has taken a replica SUV and put it in reverse and going 24 miles an hour and impacting a crash dummy or a Rescue Randy dummy. Let's take a look now at the defense's 24-mile-per-hour experiment.
We had the instrumented hybrid arm outstretched from the test dummy with the accelerometer on the hand and the forearm. We had data acquisition on the vehicle, monitoring the speeds of the vehicle. We accelerated that vehicle into the arm at 24 miles an hour to conduct a dynamic impact test to collect data certainly about the acceleration that the arm experienced, but then also make observations about the damage that we observed to the taillight. So the forearm making contact with the liftgate taillight, and then the upper part of the forearm and the elbow making contact, a direct hit into the quarter panel taillight. There's a very small crack right here in the underlying diffuser, but all of the remaining part of the diffuser in terms of this portion here and here are all intact, and same with this portion of it. So this is a photograph depicting the quarter panel taillight subsequent to the 24-mile-an-hour impact test with the ATD arm compared to that of the subject taillight.
What happened to the mass of the body of the ATD?
It rotated.
Was it projected at all off to the side?
No, we did not see make any observations with respect to any fraying, holes, punctures to the material of the sleeve.
Do you have an opinion or conclusion as to whether or not the damage that you saw to the hoodie related to John O'Keefe is consistent or inconsistent with a impact from a right rear taillight of the subject SUV?
It was inconsistent.
Were you able to reach any opinions or conclusions as to whether the damage to the subject taillight is consistent with striking an arm at 24 miles per hour?
Based upon the test results, it's inconsistent with striking an arm.
And that brings us to the next question in our investigation. And obviously, it's about this experiment. What did the 24-mile-per-hour experiment prove? What did the jury take away from this? What did they learn? Here to help answer this question, John DePietro, host and creator of Road Patrol Live, and journalist Rebecca Lavoie. She's also the host of Crime Writers On podcast. Great to have you both here. All right, Rebecca, what's your takeaway? What did this 24-mile-per-hour experiment prove?
Well, it proved quite a few things. First of all, I heard your previous guest talking about the backup distance, and one of the things I observed in that experiment was you got to go a long way forward to go backward at 24 miles per hour. I counted something like 12 parking spaces between Rescue Randy and when the car comes into the frame, meaning that there was more space before that. But aside from that, other things that I learned is that ARCA is a very good deal compared to Aperture, $50,000 versus $400,000 for experiments that look a whole lot better than high school science fair experiments. The second thing I learned is that there was no commensurate damage to the fabric in John O'Keefe's shirt at all because of that 10 millisecond acceleration. 10 milliseconds, of course, is 10 1,000ths of a second, 1/10 the length of the shortest blink you could possibly do. The taillight, of course, the damage was not commensurate with the Sally Port image of the taillight. The diffuser isn't broken. The diffuser is about an inch inside the taillight. And finally, and I think most important, what we're seeing in this video right now is the physical effect of that strike. And I think this is foundational for Dr. Rentschler's testimony. It's very clear looking at this video that the shoulder, the wrist, the acceleration of those parts of the limb would cause breakage to bones, dislocation at the very least.
I want to put up on the screen, John, a side-by-side that we put together. On the left side is the damage from the 24-mile-per-hour test. On the right is that image from the Sally Port, the actual damage photo that's been entered into evidence by the prosecution. They're saying this is what Karen Reed's taillight looked like after she struck John O'Keefe. What did this 24-mile-per-hour experiment prove?
Vinnie, I'm in the category. I think this was a huge mistake by the defense, because one thing, if you're the jury, and I've been, as you know, in the courtroom watching that jury, people wondered, could you break the taillight with your arm at 24 miles an hour? They demonstrated that. Also, now we also learned that Randy is actually a mannequin, not a crash dummy. And Vinnie, I think when the trial's over, the jury's going to say they've been seeing Rescue Randy in their sleep. But what this also demonstrated was that Rescue Randy does the Trooper Paul pirouette. And then as he's doing that pirouette, He's also twisting out of his sneaker, and the sneaker is a big part of this case where they found the sneaker. It was buried. There's no way that it was planted that way. If he wasn't in that harness, he would have gone flying the way Trooper Paul explained it. By the way, I also want to throw in, they never did any x-rays on his arm or wrist. So this business that there weren't broken bones, they don't start doing exams on people once they're deceased at the hospital. But Vinny, this has been, as I've told you, this is a video trial. This is 8 weeks now. The jury's kind of checked out. They see taillights. Maybe they're a little bit different, but they're pretty much the same. And they saw this is what it looks like when you have an SUV and it goes 24 miles an hour backwards, boom, and it strikes someone and clips them. And Karen Reed has said that so many times. I believe, listen, we may quiver over little details, crumbs, but in the end, the jury says that's pretty much what I think happened.
Let me ask you, Rebecca, your thoughts about the use of the dummy, the weight of the arm, all the issues that were picked apart by the defense during cross-examination. Do you think it undermined at all the credibility of the experiment and the results?
Well, I can't speak to what the jury is thinking, what they know about physics, what they were able to learn from Dr. Wolf's very simple physics lesson. The one thing I will say to counter John is that the jury is not comparing what Trooper Paul said in the first trial to what they saw on this video. The burden here is completely on the Commonwealth to prove that taillight pieces somehow, mysteriously and magically found their way through John O'Keefe's sleeve and made abrasions on his arm that are in a pattern of dual marks all the way up and down his arm. I don't think it was a mistake at all to show the video. I think that the jurors are probably smart. They're probably following along. From some of the other jury observers in the courtroom, we heard there's a lot of note-taking, and they seem pretty riveted during Dr. Wolf's testimony. They also seem to, as from what I was able to glean, kind of check out when Hank Brennan, the prosecutor, would go after things like the weight of the arm, because Wolf was able to explain in an impact test it's minimal. That effect is minimal, which is why they went further than conservative with a 29-mile-per-hour test.
John, are you concerned at all that the experiments did not demonstrate a puncture through the sleeve of the sweatshirt? And because that's something that is a huge part of this case, which are the wounds on John O'Keefe's arm. Yet in this 24-mile-an-hour experiment, there is no piercing of the taillight fragments or the edges that are still left on the taillight on the arm.
I think it's a minor detail. I think Dr. Wolf, his testimony of what happened to John O'Keefe's brain, and also, Vinny, this still does not compare to Dr. Welcher with the blue paint. And also notice that they also had Rescue Randy dress up as John O'Keefe, much. Some people were kind of knocking when Aperture did that. But this jury saw a very impressive reconstruction with the blue paint. Don't forget, he's also coming back on rebuttal. I think in this particular situation, this isn't about nickels and dimes. This is about, there's no two accidents the same. They have a very clear idea of what happened here when she clipped him. But the taillight, they found taillight pieces, small fragments in his shirt. And then you saw that right there in the screen. You saw the arm over and over and over breaking that taillight. The win on this goes to the Commonwealth.
Rebecca, I saw you shaking your head. I got to give you, but I only have like 10 seconds.
Okay, it's not in evidence that they found small pieces of taillight in his shirt. It's something that the prosecution has asserted again and again and again. But even the lab tech said they could not discern anything from the debris that was in the envelope that was stored in the same place as all the clothing. So it is not in evidence that there is that pieces of taillight in the shirt.
It was testimony.
All right, still to come. What did the crash dummy experiment prove?
Lori Daybell, doomsday cult mom, convicted killer, and now defendant in yet another high-profile trial.
She didn't really care who she hurt.
This time for the attempted murder of a former family member.
Just makes you sad.
And again, she's representing herself.
What about the same problem?
Are you done? Or are you just going to keep...
Will this be the final chapter in the saga
of the Doomsday Cult Mom? The Lori Daybell Conspiracy Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings, only on Court TV.
The Lexus tire spun backwards. She went backwards at least 70 feet. She clipped John O'Keefe. He fell backwards, hit his head, broke his skull, and there he lay at the corner of Fairview Road, on the ground, lying on top of his cell phone, alone.
Hank Brennan, during his opening statement, describing another big issue in this case regarding the death of John O'Keefe, which are the wounds on the back of his head. Where did they come from? How did he get them? It's a crucial part of the case. Whatever caused him to get these wounds on his head is connected to the death of John O'Keefe. So let's take a listen now. We're taking a look at some of the expert testimony and looking at the experiments that they've done. The prosecution did one relative to the wounds on the back of the head of John O'Keefe involving a crash dummy. Let's take a look at the prosecution's crash dummy experiment.
What I did was I did what are called drop tests. I took an anthropomorphic test device, ATD, which is just a fancy name for a crash test dummy, and dropped it backwards onto a hard surface to look at what happens if you were to, say, fall backwards and hit your head onto a hard surface. Shoulders come in, then the head contacts the ground. What you see is if you fall backwards and land on a very hard surface or hard surface, you'll get extremely high loads on the head. Watch when the shoulders hit the ground, then the head hits the ground. It creates kind of an arc path that will drag and slide objects up the head. So if you have something such as a baseball hat, it'll cause it to drag across the scalp, dragging it up to a similar location to where these abrasions are.
Okay, so this is extremely significant, right? These are the wounds on the back of John O'Keefe's head, directly connected to his death. So that brings us to the next question in our investigation. What did the crash dummy experiment prove? This drop experiment where they drop the crash dummy and it falls backwards. What did it demonstrate? What did it prove to this jury? Still helping us with our investigation, John DePietro and Rebecca Lavoie. All right, John, from your perspective, what did this experiment prove?
Vinnie, I was in court when Dr. Welch went over that. And I also want to just preface this, that he followed up, you remember, Dr. Wolf, that talked about the damage to the brain and really that, John O'Keefe was tragically but propelled to the ground. What this was so effective in demonstrating was this was not the result of someone just falling backwards. And again, I go back to Dr. Wolf, who was such a powerful witness, the neurosurgeon from Miami that talked about the brain, that does brain surgeries. He talked about this type of damage of someone propelled. And then when you had Dr. Welcher demonstrating that, that eliminated that he just slipped backwards and hurt his head this way. I thought this was very effective because it demonstrated the force. Now remember, what Hank Brennan, I also want to mention, Hank Brennan, he owns that courtroom. He's the one, the defense is the one that keeps changing attorneys. They hang on every word he says. But when he talks about she went forward and then back, and then, I also want to mention with ARCA, when they showed that very violent demonstration, although they showed, the dummy was behind it, it was very violent to see. And then you see the dummy go sliding. Keep in mind, John O'Keefe has those grass stains on the back. I think the Commonwealth has established a narrative of exactly what happened.
All right, Rebecca, what are your thoughts about this crash dummy drop experiment? What did it prove?
It proved that a man holding a crash dummy in a hug, then letting it go, it will fall to the ground and that crash dummy will hit its head. That is what it proved. It was similar to the paint experiment, which simply proved that if you choose to hold your arm in a certain manner in a certain place on the car, you will in fact transfer paint onto your arm. There was nothing that was equivalent to the idea of being clipped by a car in this experiment, unlike with the ARCA experiments, which employed clothing so that they could test the fabric of that clothing. This was a prejudicially designed experiment so that the people in the courtroom would see a dummy dressed in clothing like John O'Keefe's fall to the ground, but it simply proved that if you hold it up and let it go, its head hits the ground. And I think that's something that we all could have figured out without seeing this video.
John, you referenced Dr. Wolf, the neurosurgeon. Let's take a listen to his testimony.
The only way he could get this kind of an injury was to fall backwards, hit the back of his head, and then the resulting, energy forces going into his brain, into his base of his skull. His injuries were very substantial, and it's more probable than not that at some point he quickly became unconscious and was unable to do functional activities.
All right, let me ask you, John, because I have a feeling that the defense is also on board to a certain extent in that this injury could be from falling backwards. But they have a different theory as to how he could have fallen backwards. He could have been in a fight. He could have been shoved. He could have been pushed. He could have been attacked. What are your thoughts there about the defense perhaps latching on to this and having their own potential theory to raise a doubt about how and why he fell backwards?
Right now, it's all outside. And, all these demonstrations, whether it's Rescue Randy or whether it's Dr. Welcher, everything is outside. Everything is her hitting him. And then it just seems to matter, did he fall over here? Did he fall over there? How hard did he fall? But it all seems to come back to that. I've mentioned, Vinnie, Dr. Wolf, I think when this jury is done, when this case is done, you're going to hear jurors mention Dr. Wolf. That was very, very powerful testimony. I think that eliminated a lot of the third-party culprit. That was quite a moment in the courtroom when he talked about John O'Keefe's brain. And people also need to remember the presence of Peg O'Keefe, for which the jury looked straight at. Her presence remains very strong in this trial.
Rebecca, do you see a potential here that the jury could agree with Dr. Wolf, prosecution's Dr. Wolf, that he fell backwards, and with that experiment, and still come to the conclusion that it could be a result of something other than the SUV?
Well, it could be, because both of those things speak to him falling backward and hitting his head. Neither one of those things speak to him being clipped on the arm by a taillight going 24 miles per hour. It's really interesting about the Commonwealth's witnesses, and I think Dr. Wolf falls into this category. They had to go kind of far afield to find a singular expert who could speak to what they were talking about. I mean, this guy's from, Florida? And meanwhile, we're here in Massachusetts and New England. There's just a wealth of physicians here that I think probably could have delivered similar opinions, but it's his surety that I think really resonated with Hank Brennan, because he also has that surety when he talks. I think that Dr. La Posada today was a really compelling witness with these brain injuries. She actually talked about the coup contra coup. She talked about very specifically how his specific injuries could have happened. And she also did something that Hank Brennan sort of tried to avoid having Wolf talk about, but it's come up over and over and over again. She asserted that the cut above John O'Keefe's eye had to have come from a separate impact, and it had nothing to do with him falling backwards.
Rebecca Lavoie, Crime Writers On podcast. John DePietro, Road Patrol Live. Thank you both so much. Experts can win a case. Just ask Alec Murdoch, who fell victim to some of the best expert testimony we've ever seen on Court TV from Dr. Ken Kinsey. This jury has been seeing compelling testimony from competing experts, but now the question is, will Karen Reed be convicted or acquitted based upon the expert testimony in the trial? I'm Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues.